Once the whistle blows, that's it. We, a collective we, tend to forget about everything else that has happened, and there will be a pet issue that people will latch on to. So maybe it will be heat stress, or perhaps it'll be transport tickets or something like this, and that will occupy us until the next round of the tournament comes, and then we'll forget it again. But for me, to paraphrase Star Trek, it's a World Cup, Jim, but not as we know it.
Well, here we are, and I can't quite believe that we're actually here now. We are just a couple of days away from kickoff now. After a year of coverage, Mexico and South Africa will finally kick off at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday. And so with that, I'm sad to say that this will be my last podcast, last output for this Substack newsletter. And that was always the plan. I mean, this was always meant to be just a year-long project, June 11th, 2025 to June 11th, 2026, in preparation of the World Cup. Looking at the lead-up and the planning of the tournament and all the issues that surrounded it. How the world's favorite sporting event is meeting America's vision for it. It's also time to now see kind of how all that plays out. Over the year, I've written 17 stories, put out 21 podcast episodes. That's a full season of TV in Hollywood. So I think we can call that a full season of America's Cup. Anyway, I'll be sending out a note later this week to say thank you and really give some closure on this project. But we're not quite done, because this is episode 21 of 21. I can fully say that there is now buzz in America for the World Cup. People are arriving. Again, we don't know how many people will come, but people are arriving. Really absolutely loved the content on social media about people around the world navigating customs, and not US customs. I mean, kind of cultural customs or US customs too. There's been videos of Brazil's plane being baptized before it left for Newark Airport. We had Bosnians flying over the world's largest coffee pot to travel around with them that makes 8,000 cups of coffee. We had the Japanese being gifted cowboy hats as they landed in Monterrey, Mexico. We have the Spanish team in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Tennessean chefs for the first time being tasked with everything they can do with Iberico ham for the Spanish national team. There's a German fan who's delighting social media followers with his tours around Georgia, first time in a Waffle House in Atlanta, and discovering that Atlanta is a city in the forest, and just very earnestly tweeting about that. At the same time, there have been a lot of the things that we expected and hoped wouldn't happen. Needless to say, a lot of people still locked out by high prices and by not being able to get the visas they needed. There are reports of English and Scottish fans who've had their ESTAs, their visa waivers, denied. An Iraqi player was held at Chicago immigration for 7 hours under questioning. A Somali referee today was reportedly denied entry into the US. This is a FIFA referee from Somalia who was due to referee some matches, and he was turned back. He will not be entering the United States. And yesterday there was a shooting in Kansas City, not too far, not close, but not too far from England's camp. These are just a few of the things we've been talking about on this podcast: security, geopolitics, immigration, economics, authoritarianism. It's been a lot of doom and gloom. And that's been important because there is a lot of doom and gloom. Having said that, I really wanted to end on a positive note. And that's why this podcast, the final podcast, is titled Why the World Cup Matters. Because it does matter. The reason I cover this is because it means so much. It means so much to millions of people. I read a piece in the New Yorker last week, quote it. The author said, "The World Cup is not a sports tournament, but something closer to a cosmological event, heavy with meaning." And it's so true. The author went on to say that Cup is something you remember where you were, who you were with, why you were with them, why you were there when you watch that final or you watch those games every 4 years. And it's also a measure of how far you've come in your life, what you've done, how you've progressed or regressed in that 4-year chunk of time. Don't really want to think about that one too much, but it raises the question, like, why do we put up with the shit, essentially? Why is it worth still having this thing despite all the problems? And I do have respect for the boycotters, the people who are saying, well, not tuning into this one. I get that. But for some fans, that's just not an option. It's just not. I wish I were a better man than that. And I know that by watching it or attending it, you're buying into it. You are lining the pockets. But in some ways, and maybe this is just me making myself feel better, maybe it's an act of defiance to enjoy the purity of what this thing was meant to be and not all the bullshit around it. Not tuning in because of Madonna playing a halftime show like the Super Bowl. It's in spite of it. It's in spite of the ticket prices being so high. It's in spite of the immigration issues and the geopolitical issues. It is because what it means in its core is so important. And there is something about, as one of my guests said, once the whistle blows for kickoff, the noise gets drowned out. And I hope that's true. I hope that's true because there is very little noise. I hope if there is noise, it doesn't get drowned out, that it does get covered and people know about it. But it speaks to how powerful this thing is. So why does the World Cup matter? I wanted to get the viewpoints of 3 people, 3 authors, educators, researchers who have been tuned into this thing, not just this time, but for years and years. And they've been thinking about a lot of the same things I've been thinking about. And so I wanted to summarize some of those issues and get their takes on them, and then find out from them why the World Cup matters. So I'm delighted to present this podcast panel with Brenda Elsey, who's a historian of Latin America, politics, soccer, and gender at Hofstra University. We have Sean Jacobs, who's a professor of international affairs at the New School. He's especially an expert in African affairs and African politics and African football. And Simon Chadwick, who is a UK-based professor of Afro-Eurasian sport. He's also a professor of sports business and marketing, and he runs a Substack called Geosport. So I think that's enough from me. And so, once again, for the last time, without further ado, here are my guests. Well, yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Would love to start with kind of a lightning round situation. This project that I've been running for a year, really try to hit on all the kind of issues surrounding the World Cup, from immigration to geopolitics to climate to, all the rest of it, ticket prices, right? 2 questions. I'd love to just go around and ask two quick questions, right? What's the single biggest issue surrounding the 2026 World Cup? And does the US feel ready now, 3 weeks out, to host the World Cup? Can I start, Brenda, can I start with you?
Sure. What is the biggest issue? From my vantage point in the United States, and I think probably at least among Mexican fans, the biggest issue is that we are in the midst of an increasing authoritarian state that is xenophobic, but it's a shared World Cup, supposedly, between 2 other bordering nations, which the administration has threatened that the countries that participate in this World Cup may be already militarily occupied by this country, that Black and brown communities in this country are military occupied by this country. I mean, fascism. That's it. That's there. That's my concern.
Sean?
I would say for me, of course, it's the fake or attempted authoritarianism by the US, but I think it's more the hyper commercialization of the World Cup. So yesterday, for example, Mamdani announced that he could get like 1,000 tickets at $50 each, and people had to bid for this. If you compare that to the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, where I think it was almost 400,000 tickets in category 4, which were the cheapest tickets for locals, for South Africans. In Brazil, I think it was about roughly the same amount, and now we're talking about 1,000 tickets. So for me, the hyper commercialization and the fact that FIFA is just profiteering from the World Cup, and that the ordinary fan, including the people who live in the US, will be priced out, Now, having said that, the World Cup is a strange beast, and we can talk about this more again. There's something about in the lead up to it, everybody's like, is this going to take place? There's lurid headlines that are played out, and then the football starts. So there's something about that I know that we always talk about the World Cup in this way, and then once the tournament starts, then it looks like the United States is ready to host.
Yeah.
Well, and Mexico
yeah.
and Canada. Yeah.
Right, and that's part of the thing. It's like an afterthought, right? But we can talk more about that. Simon.
I mean, firstly, just to echo what Sean said, I would agree, is once the whistle blows, that's it. We, a collective we, tend to forget about everything else that has happened. And there will be a pet issue that people will latch on to. So maybe it will be heat stress, or perhaps it'll be transport tickets or something like this, and that will occupy us until the next round of the tournament comes, and then we'll forget it again. But for me, to paraphrase Star Trek, it's a World Cup, Jim, but not as we know it. For Europeans, I think it's always slightly disconcerting that a World Cup is played in a different time zone, because that completely confuses us. It means that we have to get up at strange times of the day or go to bed, different times of the night. So that's always an issue for us. We do have this rather kind of, to use an English word, snooty view, that these Americans, what do they know? What do they know about soccer? So I think there is a kind of continental parochialism in Europe about what the hell is going on over there right now. But of course, it's more than that, because I think these would be issues anyway. But it's more than that, and what the more than that is this real fear that amongst Europeans, it's almost as though that the World Cup is morphing into the Super Bowl, and what we're getting is instead of 15 minutes at half-time, we're going to get 25 minutes or half an hour at half-time, and we're going to have to sit and listen to Madonna, and it's things like ticket prices, where this crazy thing called dynamic ticketing. What the hell is that? We've never heard of that before. So it is almost as though the kind of heart and soul game that many Europeans know and love and have long engaged with is somehow being hijacked right in front of our eyes, and there's very little that we can do about it.
Just to add to something you said, Simon, you said that Europeans can often be a bit snooty and look down on Americans as, not a soccer nation, etc. But it almost feels like the US, it's a missed opportunity, because the US could have changed its reputation around soccer and its love for soccer, because it has grown. This is not 94. This is not the 94 World Cup. Soccer has grown here. Does this feel like a missed opportunity for the US, a what could have been?
Middlesbrough fan speaking here. So one of our central midfielders, Aidan Morris, is an American international, US international baller. What a baller. Boy, on that evidence, Americans can play soccer, man, I'm telling you. So I perhaps take a more balanced and inclusive view, because it's the global game, and I know lots of people in the United States who are huge fans, and there are great soccer players there, both male and female, and obviously others too. But I do sense that the good news stories that could have been told, or maybe they will still be told, the good news stories that could have been told have been totally drowned out, not just by dynamic ticket pricing and by halftime entertainment, but by, for example, the whole ICE agenda and the rhetoric coming out of US government, and the whole Israel, US, Iran, and I'd add into that Palestine too. And so what the World Cup should be about bringing people together so that we can share stories and share experiences and see the world, at least for a short period of time, in pretty much the same way as one another. That has all been completely drowned out by other things up until now.
I was back in Europe in January, and people were mad. This is when all the Greenland stuff was happening, and I happened to be in Sweden at the time, and I got the sense a lot of people told me, we're not coming to the US for the World Cup. Some people were like, we're never going back to the US. We don't want to support that country anymore. Do you, Brenda, for you, I know you focus on Latin American football. I mean, do you think that this is the Latin American World Cup in a way? If Europeans don't come and, there's a lot of matches in hotter climates, tropical climates, does this feel like it might be a chance for Latin American football?
Okay,
Sure.
So I have to digress for a minute, but the United States has won 3 more World Cups than England. And we absolutely have to stop ignoring the fact that the most important national team politically right now is the U.S. women's national team, the only one that has achieved equal pay. And I'm just going to fall out of my chair if people start talking about U.S. soccer culture. Not you, Simon, you're fine. Don't you worry. You mentioned women. But like in this whole ecosphere of commentary, it is unbelievable to me that these progressive, liberal, mostly men writers out there are going to talk about the U.S. as not a soccer nation. Like, go get whatever, effed, right? It's your podcast. On my podcast, I would say it.
Say it.
But like, this is just unbelievable. This is the year 2026. They won 4 World Cups. They achieved equity in pay. It's the same game. It's the same organization. It's the same federation. So men will make $891 million or something like that of prize money. Women will make like $100 million. And we're still, talking about, is the U.S. a soccer nation? Like, most definitely, obviously. So that's just that. Now, is it a Latin American World Cup? It's always a Latin American World Cup because they started it. So the World Cup is Uruguayan. The next World Cup should not be anywhere else but Uruguay, sorry. But it won't be their World Cup on the pitch. And it's not been their World Cup in terms of how they contribute. Mexico would have been perfectly fine host in and of itself as it was in 1970. So it's a U.S. World Cup, sadly. And, Mexico and Canada will show them how not to behave. In terms of the president and stuff like that. But anyway.
I suppose, Sean, given the world's view of America right now, I did an episode a few weeks ago about how it's hard to root for the U.S. team. They used to be this scrappy underdog, right? The U.S. men's team, right? They used to be this scrappy underdog. And now it's just hard with the power dynamics. Is this a chance, Sean, I guess, for some of the smaller African nations, Asian nations, to pick up some fans to really show the world what they're about?
Before I answer that, I will say this, though. I think it is true that the U.S. men's national team represents like a particular kind of football, which is related to some structural factors about who can play like elite club football in the U.S., how much money it costs, the college system, etc. So working class people, Black people, Latinos, they sort of, left out of like who gets to play for the United States. So that's a fact. And there's Pulisic with the Trump dance and so on. But the US is also Timothy Weah standing next to Mamdani, appealing for tickets to become cheaper, Clint Dempsey, who represents a particular kind of Southwestern working class culture. So I just want to at least add that to the conversation. Now, as for whether this is a Global South tournament, I would say yes and no. I think structurally, again, we've expanded the World Cup to 48 teams. All you have to do is, I think, finish third in your group, and you will hopefully get to the round of 32. So that means Cape Verde, who was one of the, for me, like a plucky African team, Curaçao, which is essentially kind of a Netherlands B, Jordan, DRC. Some of those teams, I think, can definitely make it to the second round. Having said that, we still have the old kind of group of death thing. Group of death means sometimes that these smaller teams don't make it past, playing with the big teams. But I think there's some chance there. And I would also say, if you look at the last World Cup in Qatar, where South Korea, Japan, Senegal, but above all Morocco really shocked everybody, right? With its run to the semifinals. Of course, it didn't beat France. There was everybody thought, oh, this is the showdown again, Senegal, France of 2002. But I think that showed that maybe there's a chance. Having said that, though, I think Morocco's run is also a bit of an anomaly, because I think if you look closely at what Morocco did, that is sustained infrastructural investment, right, in football. And Morocco, I think, unlike many of these other smaller countries, particularly countries in Africa, who rely heavily on the diaspora, what Morocco achieved there is that they managed to figure out a way to integrate the diaspora into the national football culture and make it part of the nation. So I think it's a bit of an anomaly. And I think what we might just see is that the gap between European countries in football and Latin Americans and then the rest of the world, I think increasingly, because of the structural nature of football, the European leagues, the fact that most of the players play in European leagues, and that means you don't, with the exception of, say, Morocco, you don't develop like a national football culture anymore. Everybody plays like Europe. My suspicion is that probably the teams that are going to win this World Cup is maybe France. I think France has a really strong chance to win the World Cup. England is an outsider. And then I think we're talking about the South Americans. So I don't really think that a outsider team we'll get to the final this time. Yeah.
Yeah, France looks scary. And we're talking as well on the same day that England released their squad, and I'm not so convinced. Simon, I don't know if you have you have thoughts, but
Divided opinion. The England squad is divided opinion already.
Yeah. One of the reasons I started this project was a year ago, a lot of people weren't talking about some of the issues surrounding the North American World Cup like they were about Qatar. And now they are. A lot of the mainstream media is doing a really good job, I think, of talking about some of these issues. But I remember 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, whenever it was the US won the bid, Gary Lineker said something on BBC about, this is a nation with a lot of racism, a lot of gun violence. Why are they giving it to this country? And he got a lot of flack for that before anyone knew that Trump was still going to be president. Do you think the Western media has done a good job of pointing out the issues with this World Cup like they did for Qatar? Or do you think they've been hypocritical in condemning Qatar, but not the US as much? Anyone have thoughts about that?
I mean, I think one of the differences is that obviously the lead-in time for Qatar was much longer than for the United States. And so the opportunities to scrutinise were elongated and therefore much greater, I think. And I have to say that in general, certainly in Europe, there still has been scrutiny, and that has often been, the proxy for that has been, I think, commercial interest. And I think just one of the things to say, and this is an issue for the way that in which people think about the World Cup, is the way in which FIFA and the United States have been conflated with each other, is that somehow they're both the same thing, which obviously they're clearly not. And I think the level of debate needs to think about that and acknowledge it and evolve in that respect. But there has been discussion, and there's been discussion, obviously there's been discussion this week about Ebola, there's been discussion about heat stroke, there's a slightly longer discussion around dynamic ticket pricing. You then go back to earlier in the year and the ICE shootings, and before that the Peace Prize. So I think the US has been discussed, and the problems within the US have been discussed. But I think possibly the vehemence and the depth of the scrutiny has not been as great as it was for Qatar. And I think part of this, you've got to keep in mind that many, not all, but many European news outlets, particularly in Britain, are US owned. And clearly the editorial agenda is determined by the ownership. So I think in general, the scrutiny has been more moderate than perhaps we saw in the run-up to Qatar. But as I say, I wouldn't say that there's been no discussion about the failings of the US. There has. But as I say, some of those failings have been discussed in the context of the failings of FIFA as well, which is a different point.
I think one of the thing that I'm thinking about is in 2022, I think it's right before the World Cup, when Tony Karan, I don't know if you know Tony from Al Jazeera, and Daniel Levy, who I think at one point he was an advisor to Ehud Barak, they wrote an article in The Nation where they did this thought experiment. And it's saying imagine Western media applied the same scrutiny directed at Qatar to the US, because, I mean, as you pointed out, gun violence, racism, ICE. But even if you don't take ICE, which is kind of something of the moment, although ICE was there during Obama, I think people forget that. But homelessness, militarism, it would dominate discussion of the World Cup. Instead, I think what we are getting, and I think Simon is right, there needs to be a debate about who's leading who, or whether it's a mutually beneficial relationship currently between Infantino and Trump, whether Infantino kind of benefits from some of Trump's antics. But I think there was definitely a double standard in how Qatar's human rights were being talked about. Now, this is not to say that they shouldn't have covered it. There were, the kafala system, the deaths on the construction site, the heat. Those are real issues, gay rights. Nobody's saying these are not real issues. But there was a way in which Qatar's right to host the World Cup. I think it's less so the US is right. It's more it's this guy Trump who's taken advantage of getting peace prizes and all kinds of things. But I think Qatar's right to host the World Cup, that they had no football culture, when there's enough research that showed you that there's been football and very competitive football in that part of the world for a fairly long time, I suppose, since the end of the Second World War. There was a way that their legitimacy was questioned to host it, that there was no cultural fit. The stuff about, can I have a beer? Will I be able to have a pint with my football? Well, not everybody's having pints with their football. And people had made football culture their own. And I think there's definitely a difference in the extent to it. I mean, there's really good academic work on how there was an Oriental kind of frame. I've seen an article about coverage in The Guardian, how far the Guardian's coverage was. And this is like people who have done actual research on it. So I do think there has been a slight difference in how the US has been covered. I also just want to say a quick point about, I think one problem with how football gets covered is, yes, football was introduced by industrialists, seamen, workers from Britain in South America, North America, and Africa. But people have also changed the game. I think, like, if you look at the United States, the US has like a deep history with football in the industrial kind of Northeast, in the Midwest, in immigrants coming from Central and South America. A lot of what we now think of as black football came with immigrants from the Caribbean, like the Howard University team. I mean, I don't want to go too much into that kind of insider baseball. There is a deep history of football in the United States that I think in that conversation about like who's defining football gets then caught up in these debates like, why is the US hosting World Cup? No, the US has a deep history with football, but I don't think that gets acknowledged sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Brenda, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to what Simon said, and I think he's right that FIFA and the United States have started to become conflated in this moment. Part of that is because the U.S. Soccer Federation has been so noticeably silent. And as a person who grew up really worshiping Cindy Parlow-Cone, it is the president of the U.S. Soccer Federation. It has been deeply disappointing to me as a fan that there have been no efforts to push back against ICE at stadiums, to speak about this long history of the immigrant communities in United States football, to think about the workers that day in and day out service those stadiums and have for a century. It is remarkable to me. In Europe, no FA would be this quiet. You know, maybe they support, maybe they don't support, but there's nothing in between Trump and Infantino, which would be quite regular and normal to expect anywhere else. And I think that's part of it. Remember when this tournament was first given to the United States, it was Henry Kissinger who was on the committee. I mean, so, you know, there's a long history of manipulation on the part of U.S. politicians to try to elide the Federation because it might be more liberal, because U.S. fan bases are more progressive than the larger national politics. And, you know, when it comes to journalism, I also agree with everything that's been said, but just to keep in mind that the censorship that we've seen in journalism in the United States and the corrosion of independent journalism has been a real, I think, detriment. So not to say that the Qatar stuff wasn't Orientalist, it was. And I was also in Qatar, and they actually removed a lot of critical journalism. In Qatar, let me just say, the Pakistani police working for the Qatari government dragged journalists out of the stadium so as not to cover a lot of what was going on. So it's like a global thing. These are mega corporations that own these.
Can I just say, can I just say about the media, because a lot of people get a lot of their information from the media, and so the way we think and the way we behave, the way we speak very often about events is shaped by the media. And this is hugely contested space. And just to go back to about Qatar, you know, there's a lot we could say about Qatar. About was the scrutiny deserved? Wasn't it deserved? Who was involved? Etc. Etc. But keep in mind, this also took place against the backdrop of a Gulf feud. And there's a what I consider to be a really important piece now by Tariq Panjar and James Montague in the New York Times. So there'd been a report published which basically said that Qatar should be stripped of the right to stage the World Cup. This was in 2018. And when the research behind this report was tracked back, eventually Tariq and James found that it was a consultancy in West London that had been responsible for commissioning this research. And it had been paid by the United Arab Emirates government to discredit Qatar in the midst of this Gulf feud. So to Brenda's point, I think Brenda's point is a really good one, is when people are choosing to stay silent. For example, when a soccer federation chooses to stay silent, you're going to have others who are manipulating information in the space. And therefore what we see and we hear and ultimately how we think and behave is being shaped by interests that many of us don't even realise.
I think in a lot of these issues surrounding this World Cup, it's become very clear to a lot of people how much power FIFA has. this idea of FIFA as a kind of sovereign actor, right? Simon, like I know you've talked about that quite a bit. Has this been surprising to anyone here, how powerful FIFA has been, and this kind of embroilment with the federal government here, moving in the Trump Tower, the FIFA Peace Prize, all that. Is that a shocker to anyone? How do you all see this dynamic between essentially Donald Trump and FIFA?
I mean, if you know the history of the World Cup, right, and the relationship between dictators or authoritarian governments or governments who use the World Cup as a soft power tool, countries do this with sport, right, to promote their standing in the world. Like some countries they build TV stations, others buy football clubs, and some countries, they think they're going to host the World Cup. So this is not unusual that there is a relationship between the state and FIFA. It is true, though, that in countries like in Brazil or 2014 or earlier in 2010 in South Africa, FIFA took over your space. They ran the courts, special courts. They ran the areas around the stadium, etc. They really took control and they made lots of profits there. They made governments spend so much money on infrastructure, which you never recoup. They made all kinds of promises to you. So there's something weird about the way FIFA is behaving, you're right, in which it somehow seems that they spend more time trying to be nice to Trump, appeal to his good graces, or trying to not piss him off. I think there's a lot of that sort of going on. I think at the same time, it's also very obvious that I was trying to say earlier, I do think that it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. FIFA's always played a game about how do we get something done? So when you look back, it looks shameful how things played out in Italy with Mussolini or how they played out in Argentina in 1978. But then if you understand the main purpose of FIFA at all times was to, separate sports and politics. There's specific moments where they couldn't overcome that problem, like when South Africa was kicked out of FIFA in the mid-70s, I think 1976. But that's because something changed in the governance of FIFA. Stanley Rouse got defeated by João Havelange. All these African countries, Asian countries, they managed to have a coup happen in FIFA. I think at this point, however, it's very clear that FIFA gains access and political favor. And then Trump, who it seems loves to, he loves to be validated and seems like I'm bringing the best World Cup, the most spectacular, whatever. I think they both are getting something out of the World Cup. And I think this is what we're seeing playing out in this instance now.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Mussolini, and Brenda, you started by talking about fascism, right? So I actually spoke to your colleague many months ago, Stan Pugliese, about, when Trump was on stage at the Club World Cup with Cole Palmer and lifting the trophy and stuff. And it felt very Mussolini or Putin or whatever, right? I mean, how accurate or fair do you think the comparisons are to past World Cups in fascist countries like the Italy World Cup with Mussolini or the Chile World Cup with Pinochet, right? And I'm also interested in how that dynamic's going to play out, whether it's going to be they're going to want to paper over the cracks and show that everything is great and maybe not have ice around because the journalists are going to be there. Or is it going to be no, we're going to show the world that we mean business? So I guess two questions there. Does this feel like a fair comparison to other fascist World Cups? And how do you see those dynamics play out?
Well, as a historian, I would probably push us to define fascism and be more careful about it. As a talking head on your podcast, I think it's fine. So I guess, is it fair to compare Trump to other authoritarian governments? Absolutely. There's a couple caveats, though. And one is that the United States exports a lot of its militarization and violence, which, a country like Chile did not have the capacity to do. So there's ICE and there's domestic violence and terrorization of communities in the United States. And then there's terrorization of countries like Iran and Lebanon, and the list goes on. And then there's also, I'm sorry, but the Venezuelan president in Brooklyn jail system right now, what is that even? And a complete starvation of Cuban children right now that the United States government is doing. So it's absolutely a fair comparison in terms of what an authoritarian, repressive government does. We saw the Late Show canceled last night in New York City, which was a very popular show because of the Trump administration. So in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of electoral rights and the Voting Act, in terms of all the things that you would complain about Mussolini, we don't even have trains. Okay, so there's not even an upshot to the comparison right now with Donald Trump and the complete kleptocracy that he has developed. And FIFA's very good at kleptocracy and showing how you take a public good and something people are passionate about and lining your pockets with it. So I see them as very symbiotic. I think, there's a lot of hand-wringing about issues, Israel and Ukraine and Russia, and there's lots of reports from Amnesty International. And you know what? FIFA knows that this cycle will happen. They rely on you being exhausted about it by the time the 104 group stage matches begin, and they're absolutely fine with tolerating it. So I would say this is a formula that is time-tested with both the U.S. government and FIFA. So I think it's an apt comparison. I do.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just actually a thought from earlier on is, and was to Brenda's point, it's the men's World Cup, right? It's not the women's. So what we're going to have this summer is the men's World Cup. And I hate this generic term, the World Cup. It's not the World Cup, it's the men's World Cup. And the number of times when I write something and I get edited out the word men's, it's men's World Cup. The women's World Cup is next year. So, there isn't just one World Cup and then, hey, carelessly, there's going to be another World Cup next year. That's the women's World Cup. This is the men's World Cup. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing that I wanted to say is, shall we use the word sport washing? Because all the gloss and the glitz and the glamour and, hey, we're going to get Shakira and we're going to get BTS in the halftime show, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to forget about all the bad stuff, right? Now, if this was another country in another part of the world, and we've already talked about discourse and narratives about certain countries, maybe we might alternatively say, hey, there's a lot of sport washing going on in the US right now. Discuss, but that's for people's homework tonight. The US is sport washing, discuss. But other than that, something that occurs to me is to ask the question, what is FIFA? Because we've not really clarified what FIFA actually is. Many of us probably think we know what FIFA should be, but what is it actually? Well, what it actually is that it's an elected leadership supported by machine bureaucracy. Historically, that's what it is. And if we go back to Blatter era corruption, that was essentially about electoral politics and maintaining his position in power. What we've seen, I think, over the last 10 years in particular with Infantino is it is an elected leadership and a machine bureaucracy, but with a hardcore of commercial interests now deeply embedding itself within the DNA of FIFA. And I've got to be honest, sorry US, but you're partly to blame for this, because your domestic sport economy constitutes 1/3 of global industry size. So broadcasting rights and sponsorships and naming rights and halftime shows and dynamic ticket pricing, this didn't come out of Africa. This didn't come out of South America. This came out of the United States. But I think what we're seeing with what Infantino is doing is, whereas Blatter had his approach to ensuring electoral success, what Infantino, I think, is doing is very interesting, because in many ways Infantino has sidestepped all of the major issues and challenges around, for example, governance, by answering those questions using money. So what you do is you say to Africans, I can't take money away from Europeans because they're generating TV coverage and they're generating sponsorship revenues. So I can't give you any more money. But equally, you can't go to Europeans and say, well, I'm not going to give you any more money. I'm going to give you less money. I need to give more to Africa. So what you do is you just make more money. Instead of changing the portions of the cake, you bake a bit bigger cake. And everybody gets more. And everybody's happy. And Infantino gets re-elected. The problem with that, of course, is it raises all kinds of issues, like, are you selling out the soul of football? And who's benefiting and who's not, and is this becoming an entertainment product rather than a sporting contest? But I think that's essentially what's happening, is that FIFA is, again, hidden in plain sight. It's morphing into not just an elected leadership and a machine bureaucracy, but also a commercial machine as well.
And just quickly on Simon's point, if you look at which countries increasingly, I think, are going to host the World Cup, it's basically whether they can do what Simon is suggesting about printing more money, making more money. So it's going to be in Euro America, Maybe Morocco gets a little, in the next with Spain and Portugal. So you have to do co-bids, this kind of co-bids. And even in this one, clearly this is the US's World Cup. I think it's like more than 2/3 of the games are actually played in the US. Mexico get a couple of games, Canada gets a couple of games, but this is the US World Cup. And I think the second one, it's in the Gulf, is countries that can actually afford to do these things, do it quickly with very little oversight. So the next, after I think Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, it's Saudi Arabia. So to the Africans, to the smaller countries, yes, you're going to get more money, but for you to get more money, I have to run the World Cup in the places where I can make as much money from TV rights, from commercialization, etc.
Yeah, and I think that Saudi World Cup, they're already talking about it being 64 teams. So we'll see. We'll see about that. I want to go back to this idea that what could have been, because in some ways, America feels like a perfect host for a World Cup, being a nation of immigrants. One thing, Simon, I don't know if you kind of agree, but back home, whenever I watch a World Cup, it's all England, England, England. But in New York, it's, you go to the Brazil bar, you go to the Germany bar, or there's communities everywhere, and that feels like a World Cup. Can some of the immigrant communities, diaspora communities, break through the state-controlled narrative and tell a different story? For example, Iran, can they step up and tell a different story about themselves to the world? I think we've seen the US and Iran play before, but I think if they both finish second in their groups, they might meet in Dallas. So being on home turf would be a whole different story. So does anyone have any thoughts about those narratives?
I do.
I've watched the World Cup here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Simon.
No, please, Sean, please.
No, I'm just saying I've lived here since 2001, and I've been in the US on and off since the mid 90s. So I was here right after 98, and then every World Cup since 2002, I've seen most or some of it while I was in the US. I did go to South Africa for the World Cup in South Africa, and I was in Europe for some of those, the World Cup in Germany. What is very obvious here in the summer, if you go into certain neighborhoods where there are immigrants from, say, a particular region of the world, so in Queens, in sort of heavily Colombian neighborhoods, Uruguayan neighborhoods, I've gone and done that, where you go and you go sit in these bars, and the neighborhoods, the flags, everything. There was a South African restaurant down the street from me for a while. It closed down when South Africa used to qualify, now only twice, and hosted once, and now they've qualified for the third time. But this, it changes the neighborhood. Like, so you are right. There is something about big American cities with very large immigrant populations. There is definitely a sense where people identify with the game. And also, like, my son is 16, plays like football, ECNL, which is this kind of club level football, which I love, but also I have issues around the pay for play. But in that league, the young people from there, their parents are from somewhere else in the world, but they identify with the US national team. They love the players that are playing for the US national team. So I can begin to see, even if the team is sort of like the ugly American stereotype, or Trump is trying to turn it into that, there is something about how I think people can tell a different story about the World Cup. And I think in New York, especially, Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, who's an avid Arsenal fan, and Arsenal is sort of the club that embodies this kind of value, this kind of immigrant value, the immigrants from the developing world, particularly from Africa, and Mamdani's sort of embodied it. And he's doing things to make sure that people actually can see this cup. I'm not dismissive of the 1,000 tickets, but I think it's beautiful, but a small gesture. But there's going to be free fan parks where you don't have to pay to watch football in New York City. So yes, there's all this kind of profit-making, there's a kind of a gross way in which this World Cup is playing out, with these halftime shows and the money and everything, that the Super Bowl, as Simon said earlier, like turning it into the Super Bowl. I think those things are there, but there's also something about the sort of the street culture, the democratic culture of like football in New York City. And I'll say one last thing. It's like, and this might not be the case of like turning it into the football of people from the global South, but I remember with Zidane in 2006, when he headbutted Materazzi, I was walking around the city in the week after that, black and brown, like men, women, young people wearing Zidane's shirt. There was this weird thing in which Zidane was presenting, and, he was playing something out. in how people were thinking about themselves in the world. So I don't know. I have a feeling that the streets will sort of fight against this idea to turn this World Cup into this profit-making, gross nationalist spectacle.
Yeah, what I was going to say, we shouldn't let the money drown out a lot of the other really interesting conversations that we could be having. I think we become preoccupied with the money and the entertainment, and so we should be, but there's more. And I think one of the interesting things is around identity and nationality and ethnicity. I mention my team again. We have our winger, Sontje Hansen, who's going to be at the World Cup playing for Curacao, but as Sean said earlier, he was born in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. We've also got the Moroccan team. We've kind of alluded to the Moroccan team and who they are and where they're from and what they represent and how they self-identify. But I just wanted to say a little bit about our part of the world, our part of the planet, because we do, of course, have Scotland, not just England. We've got Scotland who've qualified. And the Scots, they appear to be a more coherent and more comfortable with who they are and what they represent. As somebody from England, I really worry what we're going to see in the World Cup, because we're a nation that is not comfortable with itself. We're not happy. And as we saw during particularly the Euros in 2021, when we had Bukayo Saka and Marcus Rashford miss penalties, and the reaction to that. And I think that our politics have become even more sensitive and even more contested. And of course, we've recently had government elections 3 weeks ago in England, when we've seen a surge of extreme right-wing politics. And so I think there's an interesting discussion in there to be had, not just about what it means to be English, but what it means to be Moroccan, what it means to be Dutch, what it means to be American, and so forth. And as I say, we shouldn't let the money discussions to kind of diverting us away from some of the other important discussions and interesting debates that we could have as well.
You know, in the Independent Supporters Council, if anyone's interested, the fan groups in Canada, Mexico, and the US, if you're looking the ISC for a place to follow some of those progressive supporters groups, they will be out there doing all kinds of creative stuff. Look at the banners they had in MLS season against ICE. MLS banned signs that had ICE in them, and so they started to do these very creative workarounds. I think we're going to see that. As much as New York is a city of immigrants and a political battleground, so is LA. And LA does not accept federal intervention lightly. So I have a lot of hope that those fan groups will change our conversations. And I also think I'm not a romantic about football at all. In fact, I'm a really annoying feminist killjoy for a lot of people. But there's some creativity that is impossible to stop that will happen. There will be something that they cannot fix, a match they cannot fix, an event they cannot plan for, a player that will speak in a way that will surprise us. There will be something. And so I think football still offers that, as depressing as the hyper commodification and VIP boxes will be in the price tickets and stuff. If they could control football 100%, and by they I mean governments and billionaires, they would have done so already. And yet that's why I think people keep coming back, not only to the World Cup, but to Copa Libertadores, to different leagues and things like that. So I think that's going to be exciting and a place to look, and they'll change our stories, those fans and those players. I hope, at least. It's happened every time since. Shout out to Pussy Riot, Putin can't even stop everything.
Yeah, Brenda, maybe that's kind of a nice way to segue into my final question for each of you. You talk about this romanticization of football and the World Cup. But for me, I've been focused on all the shit around the World Cup, that I want to be optimistic. I want to be hopeful for what's to come. A lot of people ask me, there's more important things going on in the world than football, than sports. Why does the World Cup matter? Why should we care? Why is it worth still having the World Cup? And I'd love to ask each of you that final question.
I'll answer. Because. That's my answer. Because if I take myself, I was born and raised opposite my local football stadium. Literally, the stadium was 15 metres from my house. I used to, every day I went to school, open the door, there was the stadium. I come home from school, you put your shirt, you jumper down on the ground and you'd play until your parents called you in, you'd play. They were great games, 75, 65, those kind of high scoring games that you have that would go on for 4 hours. So it was about my friends, and it was about being fit and healthy, and it was about learning to lose most of the time, because I wasn't a great player. It was about learning to lose and bouncing back. But I think as I've got older and it's become my job, I go amazing places and I meet amazing people and we talk about amazing things. We share all of this around one common interest. And I'm trying not to become cliched about all of this and talk about global language and a world family of football. I'm not going to be cliched, but I think my experience of the game is not that uncommon or inconsistent with everybody else's. There are certain times in life when you've got to acknowledge that we have this saying in Britain that there's more that unites us than divides us. And I think when it comes to football, although we might have different teams and we might have different expectations, there's more that unites us than divides us. And certainly, nefarious politicians and greedy business leaders and whoever else, we shouldn't let them destroy or undermine or distract our attention away from something that ultimately it unites us. And many of us have got a long history in various ways of being associated with the game, and we should embrace that and celebrate it and be happy that when we watch a game we're entitled to do that. It's almost like it's a basic human right. We're entitled to do that.
Yeah.
I know that this isn't a visual podcast, so people are going to be listening.
I'll put the video up too.
But I'll just show you that this was.
Yeah.
You can't get three better looking guests, to be honest with you.
Anyway.
Exactly. I have to put it up.
True. Okay, so here is my fortune cookie from last night, and I'm just going to read it for you. Your love of sports will open doors to new friendships and connections.
Wow.
Isn't that wild? Have you ever thought of fortune cookie? Do you know how many people I sent this to? I could graduate from high school and I wouldn't have sent as many pictures in this day and age. I mean, when I went to high school, you didn't have that. But you know what I mean? As I sent this fortune cookie to, I was like, what? I feel so seen by the fortune cookie industry right now. Is that not the what? Aren't you jealous of my fortune right now? But I think it's true probably of all of us. And look, we're meeting today and that's the same thing. And the World Cup matters because it matters to billions of people. So anything that matters to billions of people matters to humanists, to people who care about other people. And as Simon said, it actually is a human right. I mean, it is laid out in the UN Charter, access to sport and access to these healthy recreations for a reason. And that's because all the research says it can do a whole lot of good. So there's a lot of reasons, but I think at heart, yes, it creates more violence and animosity than certain people might account for, and no one's being, sort of rose-colored glasses about it, but it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with the world. And again, I still think it's one of the few places of spontaneity, no matter how fixed you think it is, that you're going to find. It's not just football, but it's horse racing, it's epi, it's any sport. If you can control it 100%, it's not going to be that popular because people want that sort of realness in the age of manufactured.
To your point about it being a feeling like it should be a basic human right, I think that's why so many people are pissed off with the ticket prices, right? Because it's like this shouldn't be a luxury. It shouldn't be a premium experience. It should be a right to go and see something like this. Yeah, Sean?
In mine, again, it's like you don't want to get too serious about it. But when I was growing up, well, firstly, I think for me, my favorite quote in sport is this Eric Hobsbawm quote about the imagined community of millions seem more real as a team of 11 named people. And the reason I say that is when I was growing up, Brazil, because South Africa, we had apartheid, we had been expelled from football because of the policies of the white government. But that meant, you would think we were going to talk about boycotts, but we didn't in the end. But nobody from South Africa could play football. So now you're dreaming vicariously through other teams. And Brazil became the team that we lived through because they looked like us and they played this incredibly beautiful football. So the moment when we eventually became free, politically free. I know economically that's a different debate. But when we became politically free, to see our own national team win the African Cup of Nations, then qualify for France 98, it's that thing. It's about feeling that you're represented on the global stage. And then since then, a lot of how we interpreted freedom since then is to watch how the decline of the national team, the malaise of the national team, and then eventually we get to host. We went to the World Cup in 2002. We get to host in 2010, and people are joking like we're never going to a World Cup unless we get to host it again. And now we'll never get to host it again. So going to this expanded thing, and we there now. So now our imagined community is represented. And I also think a last point on that is there's a lot of suddenly there's this growing xenophobia in South Africa. This idea of kind of imagining a nation that wasn't defined by race, that wasn't defined by apartheid. But now that nation is becoming xenophobic. And the football team is instructive again. There is a player on that team who's the son of Nigerian immigrants, came to South Africa, and I think he's going to be picked for South Africa. So that idea that the nation does not have to be limited to those people who are party to the conflict in South Africa can play out through football. And here again, the women's team in South Africa this team won better because a Congolese refugee played already in the 2019 World Cup for South Africa. So that's, for me, this is why football matters. It's an incredible space. It's this one global event. It may not be the event anymore where the differences between economic, military, and football power doesn't overlap. I think now more and more it's overlapping. Like who has loads of money, run the best leagues, they have the better chance of winning the World Cup. But there's still this thing about the imagined community of millions seem more real as a team of 11 people. And that's particularly the case for where I'm from. Yeah.
South Africa again will have the opening game against Mexico again.
Yes, exactly. Hopefully we'll win this time. Not draw. We'll win this time. Yeah.
In Mexico City. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I mean, I think this is a great note to end on, to end this whole project on. So yeah, really, really appreciate everyone's time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
No, please,
should we say thank you for
Thanks
having us?
Me, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to my co-talking heads
Thank
who
you
are
too,
wonderful.
Brenda.